As babies begin to attach meaning to sound groups, that is, as they begin to learn words, they make certain assumptions. Now, probably assumptions is a word that you know already, but I'm going to define it really quick just so that we're all on the same page. Assumptions are beliefs that you accept as true without proof. Sometimes these assumptions are true, and sometimes they're not. Babies make mostly fair, accurate, true assumptions, but sometimes they make assumptions that are actually not correct. In the process of learning language, these assumptions seem to be appearing so early in a child's development and so reliable across children, across languages, that it's very probable that they're built in genetically. Some people have taken this as evidence in favor of the nativist view of language development. But whatever you make of these assumptions, it's important that we understand how babies are thinking when they're learning new words. So I'm going to articulate for you here in this lecture 5 assumptions that infants make when they're trying to learn the meanings of certain sounds. For the most part, when we're articulating the assumptions that infants have, it's easiest to identify how these processes go if we look at nouns. In other words, the names for objects, things, people, places, stuff like that. The first assumption that babies make is called the whole object bias. This states that babies believe a novel word most likely refers to a whole object rather than to some of its parts. You remember from earlier reading that if you were an anthropologist in another country, you might at some point see a rabbit run across the clearing, and some person that you're visiting with in that cultural venue, that village, might point at the rabbit and say a word. You assume that he's referring to the rabbit as a whole, the entire thing. That perhaps the word he uttered is that native language translation for rabbit. But it could be, as the author of our textbook noted, that the individual was referring to like the legs of the rabbit or its fur. He might have been saying something like it's furry, or it might have been saying it runs fast, or it might have not even been talking about the rabbit at all. It might have been saying something like, this is a sunny day. You don't know for certain, but you make certain inferences, you make certain assumptions about what kinds of things people generally talk about and how they try to communicate. And if he's pointing at the rabbit and he makes an utterance that sounds like it's one word, you assume it's probably an attempt to establish a common vocabulary. Babies go through a similar assumption. They assume that if you're pointing to something, you're trying to give them a name of an object, not part of the object or what the object's doing, or making some random comment about, the temperature in the room. They believe that you're talking about an object. In order to illustrate how we know this, I'm going to talk about a particular study. In this study, there were multiple made-up objects that the researchers invented. They were colored, painted pieces of wood. So you can see this is one object right here. It's got separate parts. There's a green part here and a colored kind of funnel shape here. And you can see that they come apart. In this other picture, it looks to me kind of like brass knuckles. Well, anyway, you see that there's this colored part here and another part here, and they separate apart. In the experiment, they would show these objects to children and demonstrate how the pieces come apart. They would hold them and separate them in their hands, and they would say, "Look at the modi! See the modi? It's a modi!" Clearly, the attempt on the part of the researcher was to communicate that this object is a modi. But we didn't know whether infants would assume that the whole object is a modi, or whether maybe just the colorful part of the object is a modi. In order to test this, they would glue to a board both the individual part of the object that was more colorful, as well as the whole object itself. And on another board, they would glue together the colorful part of the object, as well as the whole object together. With just these two pieces on the board, they would then ask the child, "Where's the Modi?" And the child would be expected to stare at the board in answer to the question, because these children are far too young to begin pointing yet in answer to a question. So, hearkening back to another lecture where we learned about certain research methods, you'll recall that when young infants are trying to be probed for their understanding of a word, we often ask them about a word, and then we look at where their eye gaze goes. And if they stare longer at the answer to the question, then we assume, oh, that means they understand what the meaning of this word is. So in this case, we ask them, "Where's the Modi?" And in answer to the question, they stare at what they think is the answer to the question. So we can tell by how long they stare at the objects if they think this is the Modi or this is the Modi. Or in other conditions, if this is the Modi or this is the Modi. And so when we do this, we find that the young infants will stare longer at the whole object than they do at the individual part. And that suggests to us that the infants are understanding this referential intent as the Modi is a whole object. Even though it might come apart, even though there's a colorful part, it doesn't matter. The whole object is the Modi, both parts together. Now, in order to make sure that the reason why the infants were staring at this part as a whole was not just because they found it more visually interesting, they originally glued both pieces to the board and showed it to the infant before the experiment even began. They hadn't yet gone through any of this exercise. They hadn't showed the infant that this was a Modi and taken the parts apart. They hadn't taught them the word. They just, before the experiment began, they showed the infant both objects and kept track of how long the infants stared at both objects. And infants stared at both of them the same amount of time as each other, which suggests that one of them wasn't more visually interesting or just more fun to stare at, but the reason why they were actually staring at the whole object when they were asked, "Where's the Modi?" is because they were answering that question with their eyes. So again, this suggests that when infants are hearing the word Modi, they are engaging in a whole object bias where they think, this new word I'm hearing must be referring to the whole thing. Not the legs of the rabbit, not the speed of the rabbit. It's referring to the whole rabbit. It's referring to the whole object. A second bias that young infants have when they're trying to learn new words is called the mutual exclusivity bias. Now, you might be familiar with the phrase mutually exclusive. If not, what that means is that two facts or two pieces of information cannot both be true at the same time. They're mutually exclusive of each other. Mutually means together. Exclusive means requiring that the other one be excluded. So only one of these two facts can be true. In this case, when we say the mutual exclusivity bias, we mean that babies believe an object usually only has one name. So an unknown name that they're hearing is likely identifying an unknown object. In order to illustrate what I'm talking about here, we might have two objects, and we might say one of these things is a blicket. If you were to look at these pictures and pick one of them and say it's the blicket, which one would you pick? Most infants, probably you too, said this object here must be the blicket. Why? Because this right here is a hammer. You are assuming that this object has one and only one name, and that if we're calling something a blicket, it's not going to be this because this is a hammer. And somebody referring to this object is going to use the word hammer. Now, this is only partially true. If we wanted to, we could refer to this object here as a tool or a piece of hardware, even maybe a weapon or a thingamajig, an artifact, an object. There's so many things we could call this thing right here. But for most of us, we believe that people will call this a hammer. And thus, if we're given two objects and we're asked which one is the blicket, if we don't know what this object is and we're hearing a novel word, we're going to assume the new word refers to the new object because the old object already has a word. Thus, the mutually exclusive nature of this bias is that both objects cannot share a name and one object cannot share multiple names. Now, that's, again, only partially true, but it's a very useful bias, even if it's not entirely true. Because if you're trying to learn the name of a new object, and there are multiple things in your environment, and maybe your parent is using a new word, and there's one new object in your environment, you can assume that the new word you're hearing refers to the new object in your environment, if you know the names of a lot of other things in your environment. So it can be a useful tool to pick up new words. A third assumption that infants make refers to this idea of idiophones and iconicity. Idiophones are words that carry meaning embedded in their sounds. Now, most of the time, this is not going to be the case with words. Most words are completely arbitrary. As I've said before, there's nothing particularly red about the word red. You could use any language to refer to the color red, and you would find that all the different words across languages sound very different, and there's nothing particularly red about those words. However, there is a tendency within some languages to have patterns of words referring to certain kinds of objects. These patterns are usually language specific, so if you're learning them within English, then you're picking up on patterns that exist in the naming of objects within English, but those aren't genetically built into you, because if you were learning French instead, or Samoan, or some other language, then you would be learning different patterns about the kind of sounds that you're hearing and the relationship between those sounds and objects in the world. But just to give you some examples, I'm going to walk through an experiment that was done, and then I'm going to talk about other kinds of things that you might have picked up on in English. So in one study, the researchers gave two words and asked young children at the ages of around 2.5, to identify which of the two objects was each of the two words. So, given these two words, bamu and katej, if you had to choose which of these two objects was the bamu, which would you pick? If you're like most children, and most adults as well, you probably picked the object on the left. This feels to us more like a bamu. This feels to us more like a katej. Another example here, we've got kejki and buba. Which of these is the kejki? Again, like most infants and adults, you probably picked this object here. This feels to us more like a kejki. This feels more like a buba. What about these? A goga and a taitej. Which one's the goga? If you're like most infants, you probably picked this object here. This feels more like a goga. And what about this one? Teitiki and mabuma. The takiti seems more like this object here. The mabuma more like this object here. So what's going on here? It seems like, again, if you're like most infants and most adults, there's a pattern across these arbitrary names and arbitrary objects. So what are we picking up on here that feels like these objects follow this kind of pattern? Well, it seems like, at least in English, there are hard consonants and soft consonants. And it's often the case that objects in our environment are named according to the hardness or the softness of the object in following with the hardness or the softness of the consonants being used. So you can look at these consonants in this word, B and M. Those are both soft consonants, B, M. These are sharper, harder consonants, K, T, J. Those are harder. And accordingly, we think of the softer consonants as being related to the flowy, rounded, bubbly kinds of shapes, whereas the harder, sharper consonants are feeling related to the sharp kinds of shapes that exist here. In these words, you can see the same things at play. The K, J, K, those are hard consonants, and B, B, those are soft consonants. G, again, soft consonants. T, T, those are hard. T, K, T, those are hard. And B, those are soft. And so you can see that as we use these soft consonants versus these hard consonants, that the objects that we choose as represented by these words seem to be pretty well patterned. Indeed, in the research studies that have been done on this topic, about 70% of 2-year-olds will match the soft consonants to the soft objects and the hard consonants to the harder, sharper objects. In fact, 83% of adults will do that. So it's even more pronounced among adults. As we learn these patterns in our native language, we identify that this really kind of happens in the real world. So you might be thinking now, what kinds of examples have I seen in my life where this is the case? One of my favorite examples is how we have an object that is called different things by children and adults. We've talked about this object already a couple times today. A rabbit is referred to by adults as a rabbit, but by children as a bunny. Why do we use these different words? A rabbit starts with a hard consonant, and ends with a hard consonant, t. Rabbit. It's a harder word. It dissociates the softness of the rabbit, I think, because many people historically have had to kill and eat rabbits for food. They've farmed rabbits, killed and eaten them, used them for fur and other kinds of things. In order to distance yourself from the inherent cuteness and cuddliness and lovability of a rabbit, we have adopted a harsher word. But young children don't have that need. They want to identify with the cuddly, fluffy nature of a bunny, and so they refer to it with these softer consonants, like B and N, bunny. Infants also have infantile versions of words. You can hear these words end in E a lot. Mommy, daddy, Tommy, sissy, doggy. Those kinds of words that end in E are infantilized. They're made just more approachable, more lovable. They just sound softer. So you can hear that as we grow older, that we kind of grow out of this tendency to refer to things with an E at the end, kind of formalizing the words, making them more hard, even though they might still retain some of their softer consonants, like in mom and D in dad. Another example is the word chair. Chair is a hard word. It has a hard consonant combination in the CH, ch, and a hard R sound at the end, chair. If you think of what an iconic chair looks like in your mind, what do you picture? What kind of chair are you imagining? If, again, you're like most adults, you think of a wooden chair that is maybe part of a dining room table set, or it might be kind of like a classroom chair, a metal and plastic chair, but usually it's a hard object. I bet very few, when I ask that question, will think of a padded recliner. A stuffed recliner doesn't seem to be an icon of a chair. It is a chair, but it's not the iconic version of a chair. Indeed, it can't be, because the word chair is too harsh a word in order to represent that bubbly, soft, fluffy thing that we relax in while we watch a movie at night. We can call it a chair, but more appropriately, we might call it a recliner. There are some other examples of this as well. Iconicity refers to the tendency in American Sign Language and other signed languages wherein there's a tendency for some signs to carry representations of the actual objects that the sign is naming. So you can see here that in certain signs, there's a certain style of movement, a certain hand shape that embrace the object that is trying to be communicated. You can see this hand shape here is almost like she's grabbing and hammering with a hammer. In this shape here, it's almost like they're drawing with the palms of their hands the shape of a house. In this right here, you can see that the shape of her finger is almost like she's drawing out, pulling on a whisker of a cat. The point here is that these signs intentionally represent objects in the real world. They refer to them in a very tangible, clear way. Much more so than, like I said a minute ago, like there's nothing red about the word red, but there is something housey about the sign house. There's something hammery about the sign hammer. And this happens in many, many signs. Actually, about 2/3 of signs in many sign languages have a reference to some iconic version of the word. Now, when researchers try to probe, do infants believe in the iconicity of signs? They have invented certain studies and looked at 3- and 4-year-olds to see, do these young children recognize and use the iconicity factor in learning new words? And indeed, young deaf children do, and young hearing children don't. This suggests that the young deaf children who are exposed to sign language for a longer period of time are better equipped to reference and learn and understand and use the iconicity that's embedded in these signs. So in hearing children who had no experience with sign language, researchers showed 3-year-olds were terrible at doing this, but 4-year-olds could guess pretty well that if you see an object, the word for that object is probably something that seems to reference that object. Like this hand is making the round shape on the bottom, and this is making a cupping shape for the top. Rather than this arbitrary sign, which is like moving the cupped hand from upper arm down to underneath the elbow. That doesn't seem to reference the object at all. 4-year-olds are also pretty good at guessing things like, if I was referencing this block with a curved U shape, that I might represent that with a flat line under one hand and the other hand in a cupping shape to represent this kind of overall figure. Whereas this right here is like a wiggly cap coming down onto another ball-shaped hand that doesn't have any reference to this object. So again, 4-year-old hearing children could pretty well guess the iconic sign was the one that represents the actual word. And if they were asked to remember those signs that went with these objects, 4-year-olds were better at remembering these iconic signs than if they were told that the arbitrary signs were the actual sign that represented that word. Whereas 3-year-olds who were hearing and never used sign language before, they didn't remember the iconic signs any better than the arbitrary signs. They remembered both of them equally poorly. Now, in deaf children, both 3- and 4-year-olds were better at guessing about the iconic signs and better at remembering the iconic signs, which means that these young deaf children, like I said before, are better equipped because of their experience seeing and understanding and using iconicity in learning signs in the past. They're better at using it in the future to master these signs in an experimental situation. So, just to wrap up this third point here, the assumption is that babies believe the names used to identify objects often have traits that actually match the object's real characteristics in the world. So, as I said in spoken languages, sometimes we use soft consonants to refer to soft, fluffy objects, and that helps young children to kind of relate the objects that they're learning about in the real world to the factors of the word that they're hearing, the sounds they're hearing. The same thing is true of young children who are learning American Sign Language or some other sign language. These infants will recognize that there's a representativeness within the sign, and they're able to rely on that and kind of see that there's some relationship between the hand shapes and the movements and the actual object. And so this is another assumption or bias that young children use to pick up new words. The fourth one I want to talk about is that naming matters. Babies believe objects that have unique names merit greater attention than objects which share a name. So, as an example, infants might be told that this is a poodle, this is a bulldog, this is a pug, and so forth. If they are given individual, unique names, then the infant cares about each name and each picture. But if instead these same pictures are shown and the infant is told, this is a dog, this is a dog, this is a dog, the infant stops caring about these objects, not just the word dog, but they stop caring about the differences between objects. It's almost like they're saying, yeah, I've seen these before, I get it, like this doesn't matter. So if we have unique names for things, infants care about the object more. Not just the name, but the actual thing. They pay attention to the details. They pay attention to the differences. They try to notice what makes a pug different from a bulldog, for instance. What makes a daisy different from a tulip? What makes a chair different from a recliner? If we have unique names for different objects, then infants start to pay attention to these distinctions and trying to figure out where are the boundaries of categories. What is the difference between... Sorry, just going to reference this figure in our textbook really quick. Figure 5.6. If you look there, you'll see there's all these different categories, and you might say, what distinguishes an apple from an orange? Or alternatively, you might say, why are these both fruit? And so they're trying to figure out where are the distinctions? What makes up an appropriate fit within this category? When is it okay to call it the same thing? When is it okay or necessary to call it a different thing? So the naming matters. That's the fourth. Finally, the fifth, the last assumption that young children are engaging in is underextension. Babies believe that words refer to subordinate level categories, unless there's evidence that they should extend its usage. So now I'm going to explain what that means. Whenever we're categorizing things, there are basic level categories that we primarily think of as like the go-to category. Some examples of this might be like deer and dog and trout and shark. These are the most commonly referred to names that we use when we're describing objects in the world. If you were to point to something in the world and call it a modi, this is what I'm talking about. It's the word that you'd primarily use to refer to a thing. If you picked up a hammer, you'd primarily call it a hammer. You could also call it a tool, but that would be a different level of understanding, a different level of categorization. And so usually the basic level is the one that we use colloquially to refer to objects. I might pick up a pen and I refer to it as a pen. The natural use of language is the basic order category, how we normally use our language. However, you might become more specific about certain kinds of things. For instance, you could break down dogs into different kinds of dogs, terriers and spaniels and other kinds. You could break down trout into different kinds, like rainbow trout and brown trout. These are subordinate categories. If you break up a basic level category into lower levels, more detailed, more fine-grained categories, then you might call those subordinate categories. You could also get less specific by grouping together different kinds of things and calling them all the same. So a superordinate example here is mammal refers to deers and dog and pigs and horses and just all different kinds of animals, but they're all mammals. You could go even higher, of course, and group together mammals and fish and call them animals, but that's not as important for what we're talking about here. The main point, what I want to make, is about what children think, and that is that they first believe that words refer to subordinate level categories. Now, if you're paying close attention, you'll recognize that that is not actually a very useful assumption for young children to make. Because when you're teaching them a word, you're teaching them a basic level word. You're pointing to a spaniel and calling it a dog. You're pointing to a terrier and calling it a dog. When a young child sees you doing that, they are assuming that you're teaching them a subordinate level word. If they see a spaniel and you point to it and you call it a dog, you're trying to teach them that this is a dog. But they're thinking that you're referring primarily to these black-haired, curly-eared variety. They think that you mean this particular kind of dog is a dog. But if they see a picture of a terrier, or they see a terrier in real life, they will not assume that that's a dog. They will assume it's some other kind of thing that they don't know about. The difficult thing about this assumption under extension is that it's really difficult to detect. Young children will avoid using words that they don't know. So, for instance, if they see a terrier, instead of calling it a dog, they won't call it anything at all. And the reason why is because they think the word dog only refers to spaniels. So if they see a terrier, then they will just assume, I don't know the word for that. If you're a parent, you don't know that your child has misunderstood something unless they make a mistake, a verbal mistake. But this child didn't make a verbal mistake. A child who misunderstands this situation will just not call the terrier anything at all because they feel like they don't have a word for that thing. However, after just a few examples, if there is evidence that they should extend the usage of this word, then they will begin to take the word like dog and apply it to more than just spaniels, but to also terriers and to bulldogs and other kinds of animals. They will begin to learn that this animal is a four-legged, furry creature that lives in people's homes, has a wet nose, drools, and has a snout. These characteristics identify a dog, but they don't learn that the first identification. It takes multiple times. Usually, it takes about 3 times for parents to point at something and say, this is a dog, this is a dog, this is a different dog, before a child realizes, oh, they're not referring to this specific breed. They're referring to all kinds of these four-legged creatures. And thus, they're extending its usage from a subordinate to a basic level. Now, because we don't have a lot of evidence of when children are misunderstanding the application of a word, it's difficult to detect this particular assumption. And so we don't know exactly how much they do this, but we do know that that they engage in it to some extent, but that it's pretty flexible and easily overcome. That with just, like I said, about 3 examples of usage, they understand then that we're talking here about something greater than what I originally believed. Like if you point to a daisy and you call it a flower, they might think originally that just only little yellow-centered, white-petaled things that grow in the ground are flowers. But if you point to a rose and call it a flower also, then they'll begin to understand, oh, we're not just talking about one specific thing here. We're talking about these beautiful, colorful classes of things that grow from the ground. Those are flowers. And so they'll begin to extend its usage. Now, that wraps up our lecture for today. But just to recap, we have 5 assumptions that babies are making when they're learning new words. And some of those assumptions are advantageous to their learning. Some of them, like this one here, are less advantageous, but even those that aren't advantageous are usually quite easily overcome so that children can can begin to grow into a larger vocabulary, and they pick up words so quickly that it's, by some estimates, as many as 10 per day during their entire childhood and adolescence. The growth of vocabulary can be astronomical, and usually only takes a few examples of hearing a word, not just to understand how it should be used, like we talked about here, but even to learn and understand what it means and how it can be used, and to recall it in long-term memory, so that vocabularies are growing just vastly from day to day throughout a child's existence.